Great. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone. And to my panelists, since we only have 20 minutes, I'm just going to launch right in. Home is where the heart is, as we just heard in the introduction. So I'm going to throw this question out to the three of you. Let's talk in terms of where you began, your geographical market. How important was it to get the exact template down before you thought about global expansion? Let's start with you, Arthur.
Sure. So home base is Hong Kong for us. So we started the company 8 years ago, and we now expanded to Japan, Korea, and then the US Western markets. So to your question, I think the home base is very important because I think as a startup, it's already very tough. And I think one of the suggestions is that you want to eliminate as much uncertainty as possible. And going to overseas market actually created a lot of uncertainty. So I would say, if whenever possible, get your kind of product or service launch in the home market, iron out all the errors first, and then before you actually expand to the overseas markets. So that's what we did.
When we were talking backstage, I thought it was interesting that you left the English markets for last. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think the English markets was the biggest and the most attractive. So actually, when we started the company, we were doing a lot of Facebook games and apps. And back then, most of the users were actually in the US. So we actually started a few English apps, but then we feel that it's actually very competitive. And at the same time, we saw Facebook was actually expanding internationally. So let's try some Chinese apps in Hong Kong, and then it just took off. So we used the same strategy, and then we localized our apps into German, Italian, and Spanish, although the translation was really bad. But it worked, because back then, all apps were in English, and then the local audience really liked it. So we followed this same strategy, and then started to localize the games in the other many different languages.
Okay, and Steve, you started Property Guru out of a frustration about, as we've all had, looking for property. Tell us a little bit about that and about creating that formula locally.
Sure. So in my case, the home market is Singapore. I'm not from Singapore originally, so I'm a little bit of a fraud in that respect. But I was living in Singapore for about two and a half years or so. And I was running a failing mobile comics startup business. And the whole property market just exploded in Singapore. And I had to move out of my property pretty fast. And I went online, and there was nothing online, which really surprised me, because Singapore looked like this high-tech society, but in reality, the consumption was still early stage, so people were not really online. The infrastructure was there, but the consumption was not really there. So we decided to build a business to try and resolve that frustration, try and help people with the whole property search process. So we started in Singapore, and quite early on, we started talking to investors after about a year or a year and a half, and there was quite a lot of pressure at that stage for us to expand internationally. And we, rightly or wrongly, at that stage, we decided to let's just focus on the one market and focus on doing Singapore well. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. So we built a strong base in Singapore. We got to sort of market leadership position where about 9 out of 10 people who were online were looking for using Property Guru in Singapore. And we've got cash flow positive and then profitable. And at that point, only at that point, when we'd kind of gone through all the lessons, all the mistakes, all the learnings, we decided to expand internationally. And one of the lessons learned from us was that in our business model, it's far more important to be deep, strong, and have a strong position in one market than be very weak across 10. So we see, some companies have gone and put pins in a map and say that we're now in 10 countries, but in reality, that depth and breadth of the relationships in each market is important. So we went Singapore, and then we did a crazy thing, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand in 3 months, and then almost killed the business. But yeah, having a strong base, I think, for us was the right thing to do, given our business model, which is a sort of a two-sided network model where you need to have strong consumer demand and also supply from the advertisers. And so building that takes time, and so I think that was the right thing to do.
Nix, what about e-commerce and mobile? Can you take that kind of geographical approach when building a company, in your case?
So in my case with Surpass is a bit different. I started the business back in November of 2001 with a couple of other partners. And we didn't raise any venture capital over the years because there really was not much venture capital to speak of in our market. So even though we may had wanted to expand beyond Philippine shores in early days, we didn't really have that option.
That might be a good thing today, then.
Yeah, so it turns out to be a blessing in disguise. We were able to create a liquidity event for ourselves in 2014 when we took Surpass public. And of course, the expectation of investors was really not a Philippine-only digital commerce play, but a regional digital commerce play. But thankfully, we already have a very strong base in our home market, and now we're starting to expand to other parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia being the first.
You said, I was reading an interview you had done earlier, and you said, whatever you're selling today may not have anything with what you may be selling 5 years from now.
Okay. So I think the mindset of any tech entrepreneur is that the core product that you should be selling is really innovation. But you try to latch yourself onto lowest common denominator principles. So when we first started our business, we were selling products that were appropriate for dumb phones. When feature phones came about, we started to repackage our products for feature phones. And now that most subscribers are starting to monetize and use these computers in their pockets called smartphones, we've adopted as well. But the lowest common denominator principles we keep, which are how do you solve for things like payment when you only have 5% credit card penetration by head count? How do you take care of something like pricing, where most app stores, for example, only allow 99 US cent in-app purchase pricing, but most emerging market subscribers cannot afford a $1 type of purchase for goods. So even things like data connectivity, most prepaid mobile subscribers don't have a data plan active. How do you solve for that pain point? So the way we solve for those pain points is what we try to stick to, because we know our emerging market customer base can only afford a certain kind of product at a certain kind of price point. So we stick to that. But as they move from device to device, capability to capability, we adjust the kind of offerings we have. So stick to lowest common denominator principles, but at the same time realize that the consumer at the end of the day is king, and you have to adapt to them.
Steve, you went from just one market to 4 or 5. Is it 4 or 5?
4.
You went to 4 in just 4 months. You expanded into 3 more markets. What did you learn?
Never to do that again. We spent probably about 2 years trying to recover from that decision, because at that stage the whole of the organization was focused just on Singapore. So Singapore product, tech, customer services, sales, marketing, everything just focused on Singapore. And then we bolted on Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and said to all the people in Singapore, now go and help build Malaysia, now go and help build Indonesia, I'm going to help build Thailand. And we stretched the whole organization over a period of about 2 years. And the product and innovation was actually leading the company up until that point. And then for 2 years, we were just trying to run to catch up. And it put a lot of pressure on a lot of people. So in hindsight, I would not do that again. But I would also concur with what Nix has said here as well, is that the consumer is king. And one of the other mistakes that we made was that we took what we had in Singapore and just did a cut and paste and thought, okay, so the business model here is really successful. We've built a great business here in Singapore. Let's now just roll it out to all the other markets, because to be honest, the competition levels in our markets were relatively low, because everyone was thinking about Asia equals China and maybe India. Whereas Southeast Asia was completely off the radar screen. So the competition levels were reasonably low. So we thought, okay, it'd be very easy just to take our product and our services and just cut and paste and put it into the other markets. But in reality, the consumer is king. And the consumer decides. And of course, buying a property and buying your home is a very personal thing in many cases. And the way in which people actually search and look for property and what kind of property they're looking for is fundamentally different in every market. So whilst the core product we have now is pretty much the same, it enables search and finding property and shortlisting and comparing, the way in which you look on top, the actual UI, is very, very different. So in Singapore, for example, it's quite a small market, quite a transparent market. People will go, I want to live in Bayshore condo, and they'll go to the Bayshore condo directory and find the properties they're interested in. Whereas in Thailand, for example, people were interested in a neighborhood. They wanted to be near a BTS station or near an MRT station. So we had to completely fundamentally rethink the front end to make it far more customizable for that market in terms of Bangkok, for example. And we did exactly the same across Malaysia and Indonesia. Each market was very, very different in terms of how people looked and what kind of things were people looking for.
Arthur, is it the same with developing games when you're going into a local market? How much do you need to know about the appetite and the customs, traditions of people and how they interact with games?
Absolutely a lot. I mean, before we go to the consumer's taste, I mean, there's also local regulations that you have to deal with, right? So sometimes, certain authorities in certain markets, they require you to get additional license before you can actually launch a game. So the way we actually tackle that is that we set up local teams. And we actually spend quite a lot of time to set up one overseas office before we move to the next market, right? Because I think it's really a very complicated task to actually get it done right. And the way that we do is that we always trust the local teams. And for example, like the Japan office, we actually opened about 5 years ago. And back then, everyone was actually trying to set up office in China. And we feel that no one's actually doing Japan. And if we can actually manage to do it right, then we can manage to bring a lot of overseas games into Japan. So it took us a lot of time, but I think it's now actually bearing fruits. And I think again, trusting the local team, getting the local people to actually run the team is key to one of the success that we have in Japan right now.
So, but from your perspective, how do you, there's a lot of countries out there, so how do you say, okay, we're going to try Japan now? I mean, I understand the due diligence that has to take place on the ground once you've decided to enter that market, but speak to me a little bit about that step before that takes place.
Sure.
How are you picking your, like you went into Europe where you didn't really have any expertise, right?
Yeah, so we look at the numbers, right? We look at the market size, and we look at how competitive each market is. So back then, when we decided to expand to Japan, I think Japan was already and still is one of the largest gaming market out there. And then there's actually relatively low competition in the sense that most people are actually playing only local games. So one might thought that, hey, overseas game will have no chance in making it to Japan. But then the other way that we think about it is that, hey, if we make it happen, then no one is going to compete with us. So we actually make that happen. And the other principle is that, I think don't do too much research. I think, you can spend a lot of time doing research and not taking any action. One of our principles is that, just get things done, collect the data, and then try to tweak it if it doesn't work. Even after you try to tweak it and it still doesn't work, then you just move on and do something else, right? I think that's one of the mentalities of being a startup, where you don't try to think too much and do your research on paper, but not taking any action.
Nix, you're always quoted as the now billionaire who used to work at Kentucky Fried Chicken. The media has forever given you that label. But just tell me a little bit, with that experience, you were an assistant manager at KFC, watching a huge company from the inside, lots of hands-on experience. Did you learn anything from that experience that you're applying to your empire today?
So a fast food store is a microcosm for a very large organization. You have customer service within the four walls of that store. You have to drive, there's marketing because you're trying to get people to enter your restaurant versus someone else's restaurant. There's HR because you manage about 70 crew who do shifts across different days and hours of the week. You have finance to make sure that your ending balance balances with your beginning balance, and depending on how many chickens and items that you sold during the day. There's a lot of operations that goes on in the back end. There's supply chain because you have to deal with the commissary. So I'm very grateful for that 1 year I spent at a KFC mall branch because I learned a lot of things about how to operate a business within a very controlled environment.
What is the advice that you could give us about when we're first starting a company and should we be thinking about things in terms of the global potential right at the bat? Anyway.
No, absolutely. I think you always want to launch locally and protect home turf, build out or solidify your business model at home, but then always have the aspiration to scale globally because if you get it right at home, and you're still alive, why bottle your dreams up in a very small opportunity? You always want to think and dream very large. I think.
Well, I guess for the e-commerce market, you're really thinking about a global, for those who are getting into e-commerce. I mean, you don't necessarily, I mean, there are models where you can start in home turf, but is it really necessary considering anyone with a mobile phone becomes part of the marketplace?
Well, I mean, the power of a smartphone today is about 600 times more powerful than an Intel chip back in 1995. So we essentially have, I mean, large swaths of the population now have supercomputers in their pockets with access to everything known to man called the internet. And a lot of things will shift. How people meet friends, how people will use their spare time, how people will make transactions, do their groceries. So a lot of things will shift. It's a question of who's able to create those opportunities where people will shift to them rather than the traditional means by which they get that content.
Steve,
Sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
I actually have a very different view in terms of whether you want to tackle home turf first or go global. I think it really depends on what you're doing, right? So, for example, I recently actually backed a company that does a dartboard with an app where you can connect everyone to play darts over the world. And the way they launched the product is actually on Kickstarter, right? So once you put a product on Kickstarter, then you're actually going global, right? You don't have to actually say, oh, I want to sell to Asia first. And the campaign was actually very successful. And I was actually very amazed. I'm actually a Kickstarter addict. Whenever I go, I just back something up because it's actually, you can actually launch product and reach, your global audience at one go. And I think previously without, platforms as such, or without the logistics and the payment that supports such platforms, you have to start with local and go home turf first. But now I think, if you have the right product that targets the global audience, you can just kind of like launch it at one go.
Hear that, everyone. All Kickstarter campaigns introduce yourself to Arthur after this panel. So, Steve, tell me a little bit about, okay, you're in 4 different countries now. What's the plan, and how are you looking at expansion from your vantage point today?
Well, I guess the most important thing is really how do we solve the consumer problem? And if I look back about 6 or 7 years since we've been around, we've definitely helped the whole consumer problem, which was the complexities, the confusion, and also the stress. If you're going to buy a property, it's going to be probably the most single biggest thing you're going to spend your money on in your life. And if you're outsourcing that decision making to agents who are trying to sell you something maybe, or to real estate developers who are trying to sell you something, that maybe not the best way of doing it. And so we're trying to really give the power back to the consumer. And so in our organization, everything starts and stops with the consumer. If we can help the consumer, then we think we've won. So then we start reflecting, okay, so have we actually done a good job on that? And I think we've definitely helped. So in other words, the market is now more transparent. You can shortlist, you can compare, you can pricing trends. We publish 700 articles every month. We do research reports, sentiment. We provide a lot of transparency, and we're putting more power back to the consumer. But then we say, how we really solve the problem? Is it now easy to buy a property? No, it's still pretty scary. It's still pretty tough. It's hard to get financing. In many cases, the quality of the information is not good. So consumers are spoiled these days. We're all spoiled. We've got so much access to so much information on our mobile devices, etc. That consumers expect a good quality content. So one, the quality of the content is not great, so we're thinking about how can we help that process. And secondly, how do we help with that last mile? So where a consumer makes an inquiry, for example, to someone trying to sell a property like an agent, in many cases they don't get a response, or the quality of the response is not good. So how do you resolve those kind of problems as well? And how do you help with the financing piece? So we're focused around that first and foremost in all of the markets, because to be honest, to do that is really where the value is. But we will start looking at new markets in the next 1 or 2 years.
Okay, we're out of time pretty much, but very quickly, I want to end on the last note. Just offer us or tell us about the biggest thing that you learned, maybe biggest mistake, biggest lesson learned, building and expanding into a global market, starting with you, Nix.
Having lesser resources doesn't necessarily mean that you're at a disadvantage. When we started Surpass, we had $1.5 US of capital, never raised VC money. Our number 1 competitor raised $27 million US in the same market across several years, and we became much larger than them. So just because you have lesser resources doesn't mean you can't build a bigger enterprise.
Great. Steve.
Well, apart from going from 1 market to 4 in 3 months, the other, I guess, big lesson learned for us was a little bit around sticking to some of your core values. Because ultimately, at least in our business, it's all about the people. And we have a set of values which we try to stick to, but in the early years, we didn't stick to those values at all, and suffered as a consequence. We were a little bit too shy about addressing poor performers or people not behaving in the right kind of way to our core values, because we felt that as soon as we start moving people out, it feels like a hire and fire mentality. But in reality, the good guys wanted those bad guys to go. And as soon as we removed the bad guys, the culture improved, the performance improved, and the business started to improve as well. So, address culture, treat culture and values is a really critical part of the business.
Okay, very quickly, Arthur.
Last point is also, I think, as you want to expand, into different countries, you have to find the local help. For us, is to set up the local office, and you have to trust the team. So, really have to spend time to find the right person. Don't rush it. So, for example, we opened up our South Korean office earlier this year. It took us over a year to find the right person. So, really spend time and then find the right person, and then you have to trust them.
Great. Thank you very much, Arthur, Steve, Nix. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.